The Mesa Chamber of Commerce Inside Business Podcast brings you a unique view of Mesa through its vibrant business community and the subjects that are important. The podcast is produced in the Mesa Chamber of Commerce Media Studio, sponsored by the University of Phoenix. Please enjoy this episode of the Mesa Chamber Inside Business Podcast.
Hello, everybody. This is Jeff Bear from Copa Health, and we're continuing our Mental Health Awareness Month podcast. Today we have Lindsay Taylor from the Hope Institute with us. So, Lindsay, let's begin by your giving us some background on who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I am a licensed clinical therapist. Currently, I'm the clinical director, as you said, at the Hope Institute. The Hope Institute, I like to say, is a center bringing hope to individuals struggling with thoughts of suicide. It's been quite the journey getting there. I started out my career in 2011 in child welfare, case managing families that were in the DCS, Department of Child Services system. And then I moved over into school social work and then back into case managing birth moms placing their child for adoption. So then I got more into helping individuals struggling with addiction. Most of the parents that I case managed were that's why they were doing adoption, because they were struggling with substance use. So that's the first time that I really got hands-on experience in that realm. And that job will always have a very special place in my heart. It was the first time that I really saw how strong a parent's love is for their child, and also the insurmountable stronghold that addiction has. Oftentimes it wasn't a lack of love, right, that led these parents to make this decision at all. It was the hardest thing to watch them have to place their baby in somebody else's hands. But I saw that grip that addiction can have on people. And then I ended up getting back into school social work, and I ended up working at a high school with teens, and again, loved working with that population. And that was the first time that I began to get really hands-on experience with individuals struggling with thoughts of suicide. This was a couple years before COVID. And then once COVID hit, we saw an increase in the individuals, teens that were coming to my office, indicating that they were having suicidal ideation. So that was the first time that I really got hands-on experience with that. And then I ended up a couple years later, actually in 2023, I believe it was, is when the Hope Institute came in partnership with the Chandler Unified School District, which we can talk about. And so then I ended up switching over there to become the clinical director, because it became a deep passion of mine with some personal experience I've been through. So we can talk about that as well later on. But yeah, that's a little bit about me and my journey to the Hope Institute.
All right. Well, I wanted to have you talk about your personal journey through all this, because that, can resonate in the hearts to whoever listens to this. So maybe this is a good point to, continue what you were just talking about and bring your own personal journey into this. And
Sure.
Also, Lindsay is having a book launch coming up, and this is probably a good point to talk about that. Then we'll get into some questions on the base subject of this podcast. So talk a little bit about your personal journey here.
Yeah, sure. It's so interesting because in 2021, here I am helping kids and families struggling with mental health issues, like I said, suicidal ideation, all those things. And I'm helping people professionally, and then I'm dealing with it personally in my own home. So in 2020, when COVID hit, it really was such a marker, even in my own personal story. My son had began to experiment with marijuana use. And unfortunately, not right or wrong, but many teens get into that teenage experimentation with drugs and alcohol. And marijuana nowadays is not like what it used to be. So he started getting into vaping marijuana, and it's very high potency. So what happened for him was, once they were out of school, he had more time on his hands. He really got heavy into the marijuana use, and we watched it completely change him. And so here I am, dealing with this professionally, but also personally. My son is struggling with substance use, which then led to mental health struggles. Prior to this, he was a competitive gymnast. He ended up quitting gymnastics. He really just got burnt out on it the summer before he went into his junior year. And junior year was when COVID hit in the spring of 2020. And so it was at this point that he, no longer had gymnastics. So I think he lost a big part of his identity that was part of his life growing up, a huge part of his life. And now he has extra time on his hands. He's spending more time at the skate park. And so he ended up starting to struggle with this. And it led down a path where it would ultimately lead him to have suicidal ideation himself. And what's interesting about that I think is important to point out too, is you never think it's going to happen to yourself, right? And you always say like, not my kid or not my family, right? And I really learned through that time that absolutely nobody is immune to these struggles. And my son even said that same thing. So about a year prior to this, I was on the crisis team and I was serving I was helping with one of the suicides that we had at one of the schools. And I came home that night and we were talking about it at the dinner table. And I remember my son saying something along the lines of, I don't understand that. That's so selfish. I don't know why people do that. And so he didn't understand what would lead somebody to have thoughts of suicide and why they would take their life. So I had to help him have some empathy around that and some compassion and say, hey, somebody has to be in a really difficult spot to get here. So imagine what they're going through, right? To get to that place. And so here's somebody, him, who didn't understand this, who was totally against it, if you will. And then about a year later, here he is experiencing thoughts of suicide. Again, I think the drugs was the big turning point in his story that led him to start to have these mental health struggles. But we started to deal with that with him. He was hospitalized a couple times. I learned a lot through that process with hospitalization, that it's more just stabilization, not actual help or treatment. So I myself was having a hard time figuring out where to go and where to turn to get my son the help that he needed. And it would turn out at the beginning of May. So I'm going to back up for a minute. Here I am professionally, like I said, working in the school. And I had one student in particular that I became close to, developed a good rapport with, who was struggling immensely with suicidal ideation. He had a couple prior attempts. And so early May 2nd of 2021, I got a call from my boss that he was in the hospital, that he attempted, and it didn't look like he was going to make it. So he would end up dying by suicide on May 2nd. And then it was absolute crisis that week in our school. It was a really heavy, hard week. And exactly 7 days later, my husband and I would get the call that our son was brought in with no pulse. And we ended up losing him to fentanyl poisoning. So, gosh, that was quite the time in my life.
Lindsay,
Yeah.
how do you take such a horrific personal story and turn it into anything positive? And in your situation, unlike many people that go through that, this is your work. How were you able to regroup? And this is probably not the best way to say it, but make the most of this just horrible experience that you and your family went through.
Yeah. So read my book because it will tell you my entire story.
Lindsay, you have a book?
Yeah.
What is the name of the book?
So the book is called The Rise of a Soul Soldier. And because this story is way too long for this podcast, but to just kind of give the Cliff Note version, there was essentially some things that happened actually right before my son's passing that really ended up helping me see that there's something far beyond our human comprehension to all our lives and stories. And what happened was, I started to understand this idea that there is purpose to our pain. And that actually, when we go through these deep struggles, that's what ultimately can grow us, grow our souls. We expand in that process if we allow it to change us. And so I really became completely transformed and changed through that process. And I experienced, and I'll just say my faith, I'll say it was God. That's who showed up profound for me in that time. And it really changed the entire trajectory of my grief. So I get really into that whole story in my book. But it really was put on my heart that there's something far beyond our human comprehension to all our lives and stories. And so I really took that time and it became a mission of mine to ultimately help, people who are struggling with addiction, suicidal ideation, just any grief, life's deepest challenges. A lot of times they're in the darkness, right? And ultimately, I found the light through all of that. And so that's what my book is all about, helping people turn their pain into purpose.
Well, let's kind of switch gears a little bit here.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest barriers individuals facing suicidal thoughts encounter when trying to access some kind of treatment?
Yeah. So again, here I was as a mental health professional. I know a lot of the resources, right? And still I was having a hard time finding help for my son. So I can only imagine parents, families, people trying to get help in a system that they know nothing about, right? Maybe they don't have that experience like I had. I can't imagine how they feel trying to access help. So I think the two biggest barriers that people face is finding the right help, right, for themselves or their loved one, and then financial. And that was also the case for us. And so what's awesome about the Hope Institute, and we're going to get more into that, historically, like when I was helping kids, connecting families to resources with kids who were struggling with suicidal ideation, really the only options we had was hospitalization. There was not much out there to address individuals struggling with thoughts of suicide. So now the Hope Institute comes into play, and we actually have a center that specifically targets and treats this, and it's outpatient. I'll get more into that in a minute. But so that's a big barrier, is finding the right kind of help and actually getting the treatment, not just a Band-Aid, if you will, or stabilization, actually getting help for it. And then the financial piece we also address at the Hope Institute. It's very expensive when you go the hospital route. And again, that's just a stabilization. It doesn't actually treat the issue.
Could you talk for a minute about the short-term programs versus long-term programs, benefits?
Yeah. So I like to look at this like with different levels of care. So we have at the highest level of care, you have residential treatment centers, right? And so some people, they need the most intensive level of support. And so that longer term care, but a lot of individuals who, and again, if we're talking specifically that are struggling with thoughts of suicide, they can receive outpatient counseling safely in the right setting with the right support. 90% of individuals actually can receive treatment in an outpatient setting. Only 10% need that hospitalization. We consider that imminent danger. So yeah, at the outpatient level, short-term treatment, we are intensive. So clients can come up to 4 times a week if needed, because oftentimes that is needed, more of that intensive support. But they can stay in their communities, in their homes, around their natural coping. They're not taken out of that like they are when they're hospitalized or when they're put in residential treatment centers. And I think, again, those places have a time and place. Hospital, residential treatment centers, those things are sometimes needed. But if we can keep people in their home and also provide counseling and support to the family dynamic, then we're helping with the healing within the home, and it's not an adjustment when they get out of a hospital or when they get out of a treatment center. We're already putting things in place to support that transition, and to give families the help that they need to support their children and their loved ones.
So along with the phrase, if you see something, say something,
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the key signs that a family member or friend can look to recognize that their loved one might be in some danger? And then what kind of steps can they take?
Yeah. So I think, I always say, your loved one best, right? Like if you feel like something is off, something's changed, one of the biggest markers is we have sad and bad days. That's normal. But if those sad and bad days are becoming for a lengthy period of time, if you're noticing a complete shift in their mood, they're maybe not taking care of themselves, they're not showing up for, they're not going to school, they're not going to work, whatever that is, if we're talking kids or adults. But if you notice a change in their behavior, I think that's one of the biggest signs that you might need to ask them if they're struggling. And I always say, it's okay. And you need to do this. If you are worried about your loved one, if they're showing some of these signs, ask them straight away, are you having thoughts of suicide? Because that opens the door for that conversation and destigmatizes it and helps them feel okay with saying yes, if that's the case. And if they're not, they'll tell you no, right? There's also this idea that if we ask that question directly, we're going to put the idea in somebody's head, research shows that's not the case. We cannot do that. We don't have that kind of power. If somebody's not, they'll tell you no. But if you ask that question and they are, now you are a safe person for them to open up to, because you've opened that door. So I always say, ask the question directly if you are concerned, if you notice these changes in behaviors. And then I would say the next step is reaching out. Again, there's 988, which is the suicide lifeline, which we know is huge, and they have tons of resources. So you can call and you can get connected with resources that way. There's a couple urgent care places. So there's a Mind 24/7 is a mental health urgent care that you can go to. But again, those places are just going to stabilize. They're not going to treat. So you need to definitely get to seek counseling. And the Hope Institute is where we come in, and we call it Bridge That Lethal Gap, where we provide that intensive support, suicide specific treatment. So we would be a great resource as well if your loved one indicates that they're struggling with thoughts of suicide.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the Hope Institute?
Yeah, so the Hope Institute is, like I said, Suicide Treatment Center. And what we do is we use, it's the Hope Institute model. But within the Hope Institute model, we use a model called CAMS. It stands for Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. It's a mouthful. But with that model, what we're doing is we're getting to what is the client's drivers. That's what's leading them to have thoughts of suicide. And then we're basing our entire treatment around that. So we are really trying to get to the root issue. We're not just stabilizing. We're not just putting a Band-Aid on it. We are addressing what's leading to the suicidality, and we're focusing our whole treatment around that. So we use that in conjunction with a therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy. And really, that's just addressing some of the big things that we as humans need. Emotion regulation skills. How do we handle distressing situations, crisis situations? So distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, how to have healthy relationships and communication. All of those things are things that can ultimately lead people to these struggles. And so we use that a lot in our therapeutic model as well, to address the client's drivers, to treat the issues, the underlying issues. And then any what we call indirect drivers, so things that might not be leading directly to the thoughts of suicide, but like are causing them struggles in their life. So that could be grief, family conflict, depression, anxiety. Then we refer to ongoing counseling. So the Hope Institute is a short-term treatment because we're just focusing on that suicide-specific treatment. So on average, clients are in our program 6 weeks, and then we help make those referrals to the ongoing counseling. So again, we don't just, we help families navigate the system. We don't just say, okay, your treatment's done and go find something else. We want to give that warm handoff to that next counselor. So that's really huge as well, I think. And then clients can come up to 4 times a week, like I said, so it can be intensive. And we offer a mix of individual counseling and DBT skills sessions, which is like group sessions. And we also offer family support and therapy as needed if that's a part of the client's direct driver.
You've given us a lot of food for thought here today. Is there anything in summation you'd like to add or really drill down on at the very end here?
You know, one other thing just to add with the Hope Institute that I think is important is we offer next day appointments. So people can get in within 24 hours. I think when we're talking about suicide and crisis, getting people in immediately is important. So I just want to add that. And then, I think I just want to speak to the person out there who is struggling potentially with thoughts of suicide or just in the deep depths of despair. I just want that person to know that there is life beyond that mountain of pain that might be in front of them. And it's hard to see it when we're in it. And I've been in it. I've been in the depths of darkness. But beyond the darkness, there is life and hope. And so with the right kind of help and the right support, I just want people to know that hope and healing is possible. And for loved ones who are supporting somebody who's struggling, I think that's a whole nother battle that we face. It's very hard to support somebody struggling with this thing. And so with this sort of thing. And so I just want those people to know that they're not alone either. And that the best thing that you can do is come at it from a place of influence, like influence meaning stay calm, right? Show love and support. I think oftentimes we let fear lead in these situations, rightfully so, right? Like if we have a kid who's struggling with suicidal thoughts, for example, that's a really scary thing. But we don't want fear to be our guide in getting our kids help. And so remaining calm, listening, asking questions, and then finding that support is key. But I just want that person to feel seen too, that you're not alone if your kid's struggling.
That's a great message. Well, I want to thank you very much for being here today and sharing your story and the story of the Hope Institute and your new book. I hope it becomes a huge bestseller for all the right reasons. And I'd like to thank everybody for listening and to continue to pay attention to these podcasts that we're running in the month of May on mental health awareness. So once again, Jeff Bear, Copa Health, signing off. Thank you.
This has been a Mesa Chamber of Commerce Inside Business podcast. You can find all podcast episodes at iTunes, Spotify, or your own favorite podcast website. You can also find them online at mesachamber.org. Content of this podcast is copyright the Mesa Chamber of Commerce, unless otherwise noted.